I'm the Game Professor, and welcome to Games as Lit 101. Today's topic is fairly complex, and it's a great lead-in to next week's analysis. We're talking about giving voices to silent protagonists, why it happens, and what has to be considered when it does. First, we need to establish why silent protagonists exist in the first place, and the simplest answer is that in the early days of video games they were both easier and perfectly adequate. Setting aside the fact that video games didn't really focus on storytelling much until about a decade into the medium's life, there simply wasn't much available space for a game's content. Adding dialogue for the character who would be around for the entire game would add a good deal of data to crunch into those tiny cartridges. And to add to it, quite frankly, it wasn't necessary. The simple stories of older games only really needed dialogue to direct the player from place to place. These games used minimal dialogue from NPCs to explain what you had to do, and they implied your consent based on the expectation that you would continue to play the game. So long as a game simply gave you instructions so you could keep playing it, your character didn't need to have a voice or personality of our own, they simply allowed you to keep going. In short, it was both difficult and unnecessary to give the player character any dialogue or even a personality at all. But of course that's not true at all anymore. It's hardly enough work to be considered major in light of how much work a game takes to make nowadays anyway, and we have enough space on our disks and hard drives for basically as much content as we want in the games we play now. So why does the silent protagonist still exist? Well, for as well established as the concept is, it's not actually very common in video games anymore. In fact, just about the only places you'll find it are either in sequels to classic series, or in games that are trying to emulate older games. You'll still find silent protagonists in some classic series like The Legend of Zelda, and this is often as much out of tradition as it is a conscious design choice. A few first-person games will do it too, such as the Portal games or the Half-Life series, as will games inspired by old-school aesthetics like Undertale. But generally, you'll either have hybrids, like the Elder Scrolls series, which doesn't have a voice for your character but allows you to communicate with others nonetheless, or fully voiced projection protagonists like Commander Shepard. These accomplish a similar narrative purpose as silent protagonists, but since we're specifically talking about giving voices to established silent characters, we'll stick to characters who don't have spoken lines. Sometimes a video game series that started out with a silent protagonist back in the early days of gaming wants to add more personality to the character or depth to the story. Or sometimes, for that matter, a game will get an adaptation into television or film, and the idea of the silent protagonist doesn't usually work too well in those mediums. But historically speaking, these attempts have had mixed results. The most famous may be the Legend of Zelda cartoon, which interpreted Link as a whiny brat and gave him the voice to fit.
Hey! Excuse me, princess!
Mega Man 8 had animated cutscenes, and Dr. Light was...
You must recover all the energy immediately, Mega Man. When we find that meteor, we'll find Dr. Wily.
not great. But in all fairness, there actually have been plenty of attempts that have worked out perfectly fine. In fact, there may even be more of them than those that haven't. Jak 2 did a great job adding a voice to the protagonist, even in the face of a major tonal change. When Metal Gear Solid took the Metal Gear series into the age of cinematics and voice acting, it actually did a pretty good job. And while Mario is still technically a silent protagonist, what voice he does have has become iconic. But nevertheless, the idea of giving a voice to a beloved character who previously didn't have one tends to scare people. And it's actually pretty easy to understand why. It could be compared to a book-to-film adaptation. Since visuals are largely represented in books through descriptions that allow you to imagine and infer things in your mind, it's entirely possible that fans could be disappointed with how a movie chooses to show these things. It might not live up to the imagination and what they had in their head about it. Similarly, it's easy to see why we would be concerned that the voice or personality given a character wouldn't fit what we've assigned them. After all, silent protagonists are meant, to one extent or another, for us to project our personality onto them in the context of the game, its story, and their actions. So each of us forms our own idea in our heads of what these characters are like, and really bad writing or really bad voice acting can seriously mess that up. Link's voice in the cartoon, aside from, like I said earlier, being the most famous example, is probably also the best one. Most Zelda games give us little information about Link's personality aside from his noble courage and heroism, especially back when this cartoon was made. So it's assumed that his silence implies a continuation of those traits through his speech. But in the cartoon, he didn't sound heroic. He sounded silly, and he talked and acted like an annoying brat rather than the hero of Hyrule.
Looking good, princess! Especially from this angle!
Oh!
Oops. Guess I offended her royal prissiness.
Suddenly, a character millions of gamers had connected with wasn't heroic or noble as the game had prompted them to imagine, but whiny and annoying. And imagine how much worse the effect would have been if that had happened in one of the official games.
Great! I can't wait to bomb some dodongos!
That doesn't count! So obviously this is an important issue for adapting video games or for adding voices to classic series. So that means we need to ask what considerations are important for such a process. Well, firstly, and most obviously probably, the writing and the acting needs to fit the character. This was the major mistake made with Link. The established elements of Link from the games, his bravery and his courage, these were outright contradicted by the way the character was written, acted, and directed in the cartoon. Allowing Link to express himself was fine, but he expressed himself in a way very different and even antithetical to the implications of his actions in the games, and as a result to the perceptions we all had of who this character was and what he was like.
Excuse me, princess.
Secondly, the tone of the story needs to be considered, as this is going to affect the way the character is written and acted. For instance, in Jak 2, when they darkened up the story and raised the rating from an E to a T, they also gave Jak a voice. He was appropriately dark for the game, but also often showed levity and joked along with his wacky sidekick Daxter, and his voice actor, Mike Irwin, pulled both off quite well. The character fit the darker tone of the game, but also didn't fully abandon the lighter tone of its predecessor. Another great example is Snake from the Metal Gear series. Leaving aside the issue of which Snake is a clone of which or whatever, when the character gained a voice and more character development in Metal Gear Solid, they maintained the same tone, ensuring the transition was smooth and fitting for the character. And finally, the character's development must be thematically consistent with the original game or games. Samus was one of the first powerful female characters in video games, and it was only fitting that she would eventually get a game that developed her character to be a strong one too. But when developing a character who spent almost all her other games surviving alone in hostile situations, working entirely independently of any governing body or group of people, Metroid Other M made a story about her loneliness, dependency, and longing for a man. None of these things are bad, but it really doesn't fit Samus's character or the meaning the series had gone for up until then, so the result was contradictory in a number of problematic ways. We'll talk a whole lot more about Other M next week, but this is a perfect example of the problem, when a character is given a voice and developed in a way that is entirely independent of, or even in opposition to, what previous games had built them up to be. That's not great. Ultimately, simplifying such a complex process down to 3 criteria is not going to result in a comprehensive methodology for developing and voicing previously silent video game protagonists, but it is a good place to start. Keeping these principles in mind and working with a talented team can grant any video game character a personality and a voice worthy of their legacy. So if you have any thoughts on the subject, feel free to comment on it. And if you enjoyed the episode, make sure to hit that subscribe button down there and check the description for links to Games is Lit 101 on Facebook, Twitter, and Patreon. Next week, it's time to confront Metroid Other M in full detail. So, until then, class dismissed.